SEP Fanfic Readings presents Osculum Annuum by My Delphi. Chapter 8, 7th Year, Part 2. Hermione's heart was beating painfully against her chest as she stared at Harry. She couldn't tell him. She simply couldn't. He wouldn't understand, and then she would lose him too. The last one to remain at her side, and he would be gone, and she would be all alone, and— Hermione. Harry's voice was gentle, and she broke. No, it wasn't a gift from my parents. The admission was barely more than a whisper. Her best friend inhaled sharply, and his hands briefly tightened their hold before he visibly forced himself to relax again. Then who? I can't tell you. The finality in her words rang through the tent. And I won't. You know who still has a link to your thoughts and dreams. If he found out, it would be one more vulnerability for him to exploit. We can't risk that. Oh. Harry blinked before he nodded. Of course, I forgot. But was Victor right? Hermione smiled slightly, but it felt brittle. I don't know. The one who gave it to me said that it was meant for protection. I don't know if he had intended it for it to be a courtship bracelet. I don't think so. Her usually unobservant and endearing oblivious friend was for once startlingly perceptive. If only he was perceptive about things other than her tragic love life. But alas, he wasn't. Could that have been his intent? Are you two together? Maybe. We never clarified what we were. Her cheeks suddenly felt warm. They certainly never were together, but she liked the thought of it, and the dreams caused by the locket had, and still were, pleasant. She could imagine a relationship with Draco, as unlikely as it was. And all this time I was convinced you were hopelessly in love with Ron. Harry snorted, breaking the tension that had settled in the air. And that you took McLaggen to Slughorn's party to make Ron jealous. I'm really bad at noticing things, aren't I? No. Well, a bit. Hermione laughed quietly. But I'm simply very good at keeping secrets. Following her admission about the bracelet, Hermione often caught Harry looking at her thoughtfully. She knew that he was trying to figure out who it was, and she wondered who he might consider, but they didn't talk about it again. Still, it was a relief that she didn't have to keep all that had happened to herself. It meant she didn't have to tug her sleeve over the bracelet, and she didn't have to resist the urge to fiddle with it when she felt anxious, which was most of the time these days. But the knot of worry and anxiety wasn't as unbearable anymore. Their evening filled with silly dancing had lightened the mood somewhat, and even the burden of the locket had lessened. They were both able to laugh, and instead of seeking solitude, they often spent the evenings musing over the adventures during their first years at Hogwarts. The light-hearted ones. Like successfully smuggling a dragon into and then out of Hogwarts, or secretly brewing polyjuice potion. Harry teased her about her hopeless crush on Gilderoy Lockhart, and Hermione hid behind her hands as she remembered that she had gotten blasted outstanding in that ridiculous test of his. She teased Harry in return for his panicked expression as he had been forced to open the dance at the Yule Ball, which made him turn red from the tips of his ears to the collar of his pullover. They mused about what they had missed most about the Muggle world while at Hogwarts, and composed a list of Muggle things that would amaze Arthur Weasley to the point of ecstatic excitement. Then they ranked their DA professors from best to worst, save Snape, whom neither mentioned, arguing fiercely over whether Lockhart or Umbridge had been less qualified. Hermione argued fiercely that at least Lockhart had made them use their wands, while Umbridge had relied on textbooks without instructions, to which Harry countered that she was only saying it because she still had a tiny crush on Lockhart. It made her chase him around the tent with a pillow, hitting him with the lumpy thing until he conceded that she was right. One evening, after eating dry bread with cheese for the 5th day in a row, they dreamily gushed about the different feasts at Hogwarts and what their favorite meals had been. Harry, with his sweet tooth, remembered Halloween fondly, while Hermione, ever the daughter of 2 dentists and a proud swot, preferred the welcome-back feast. Together they remembered the endless rows of food, their mouth watering and stomachs growling as they sipped watery tea. Their light-hearted banter and easy chatter had one disastrous consequence. Hermione was less cautious. When Harry mentioned going back to Godric's Hollow in an attempt to find the Sword of Gryffindor, and for more information, she agreed. But when they arrived and were invited by Bathilda Bagshot, she wasn't suspicious enough. Trapped between the emotions as she stood with Harry at the grave of his parents, the hope that they were finally making progress again, and trying to find a way to ask Bathilda to sign her copy of A History of Magic, Hermione walked straight into Voldemort's trap, dragging Harry with her. She even stayed behind when Bathilda took Harry upstairs, ignoring the growing uneasiness in the pit of her stomach. And then she found the flies and the blood. Her scream of "Harry!" came too late, and by the time she had scrambled up the tight and narrow stairs, he was already facing Nagini. In her panic and the flurry of spells fired by both her and Harry, she accidentally snapped his wand. Sitting in the Forest of Dean, down a wand and both disappointed by Dumbledore's past, their subdued moods had returned. It hadn't been worth it, and the advantage they had hoped to get had turned into a disadvantage instead. But their subdued mood wasn't the only thing that returned. One morning, Hermione woke up to find Harry's bed empty. Throwing a jumper over her head, she stumbled out of the tent, afraid that he had left her as well, only to run straight into Ron, who gave her a sheepish smile and scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. Had it not been for Harry holding onto her wand, she would have hexed Ron until he couldn't walk straight for a month. But instead, she was forced to listen to his stammered explanation and hear him apologize repeatedly with a growing urgency, while she simply stared at him. Eventually, she turned around with a huff and marched to the edge of their wards, where she sank against a tree until her anger at seeing him again had dissipated, or at least lessened enough that she didn't have the urge to punch him anymore. The last time she had punched a wizard, it had led to said wizard kissing her. She didn't need a repetition of that with Ron. It was easier to accept Ron's return when both boys revealed that they had gotten their hands on the sword of Gryffindor, and that they had destroyed the locket. She hadn't forgiven him, not yet, but her relief of Harry and her not being alone any longer, and having someone else there won out, and she begrudgingly accepted his presence. That evening, when taking another vial of the potion Snape had brewed for her, a sudden thought crossed her mind. The sword had been in Snape's possession. Students had attempted to steal it, but failed and been caught, which undoubtedly meant that he had taken more safety precautions should they try again. It would have been impossible for anyone to steal it. But then, how had it ended up in the Forest of Dean, not far away from their tent, with a Patronus guiding Harry's way? Every evening, Hermione tried solving the riddle that was their sudden acquisition of the sword, as well as Professor Snape, but she had never found a satisfying answer. Her theories, ranging from semi-sentience of the sword to Snape not being as loyal to Voldemort as everyone thought he was, never quite added up. There were always missing puzzle pieces, gaps she couldn't fill, and contradictions that irked her and shortened her temper. It didn't help that Ron seemed to seek her out constantly, admitting quietly that he had thought about her almost every day. Harry, now aware that Hermione most definitely wasn't in love with Ron, did his very best to interfere, and thus lessen the tension in her shoulders. It made her want to pull him into a hug and hold on to him until the war was over. Ron's eagerness to earn her approval and trust once more led to him agreeing with her when Hermione proposed going to the Lovegood home, upon remembering the pendant Xenophilius had been wearing at the wedding, and what Victor had said about it. And once again it was a trap. They barely escaped, Death Eaters hot on their tail, and Hermione's heart broke. She understood why Luna's father had betrayed them, and it was the final proof she needed to know that her decision to obliviate her parents had been the right one. When they had escaped Godric's Hollow, they lost a wand. When they escaped the Lovegood home, they didn't lose anything, yet they hadn't gained anything either, other than a fairy tale and the vague promise that the Deathly Hallows were real. It didn't help them at all, and even Hermione had no idea what to do next. She assured Harry that she just needed some time to figure out a plan. A few days at most. But days turned into a week, and a week turned into 2, and then 3, and then a month. And then Harry broke the taboo. Malfoy Manor was grand, imposing, and undeniably beautiful. The pure history behind the estate briefly awed Hermione, who was an avid reader of Jane Austen and loved her criticism of society in the upper class. Malfoy Manor was the kind of grand estate where one wouldn't be surprised should they suddenly run into Mr. Darcy. As they were led through the intricate, wrought-iron gate, she briefly felt as if she had entered a period drama. Silver moonlight was reflected by decorative ponds and white marble statues. Soft lanterns glowed in the dark, and fairies were dancing over beds of moonflowers, or just above the surface of the water, like small fireflies. She could hear a nightingale sing in the trees. near what she presumed to be a fairy hive, and in the distance there were the calls of the moon calves. But then the snatchers twisted her arm as they reached the ornate front doors, and she cried out in pain. And suddenly the beauty of it all was gone, and in its stead was terror. Because this was it. They had lost. The hex she had managed to send Harry's way to disfigure him would heal eventually, and with no wand to renew it and no chance of escape, it was only a matter of time until his identity would be revealed. They had failed. She had failed. The tall corridors with countless portraits of Malfoy ancestors, heavy drapes, and beautiful wallpaper seemed like prison walls, and the old window panes reminded her of bars hindering any attempts to escape. And then they were dragged into a drawing room and came face to face with the Malfoy family and Bellatrix Lestrange, Narcissa Malfoy's older sister. Hermione was aware that multiple Death Eaters had been freed following Voldemort overtaking the Ministry, but she was still startled upon seeing Lucius Malfoy. He looked nothing like the man she had met at the beginning of her second year, nor the man she had encountered in the DOM. His hair was ragged, his face sunken in, and unkempt stubble gave him a rugged appearance. There were dark shadows underneath his eyes, and his skin seemed almost sickly pale. The high collar of his dark, expensive robes couldn't hide the Azkaban tattoo on the left side of his neck. His wife was a startling contrast. Narcissa Malfoy was as poised as she had been at Madame Malkin's shop. Her blonde hair was well maintained and carefully styled. Her lips were painted red, and her dark dress didn't have a single crease. She didn't fit the picture of her worn-looking husband, never mind her crazed sister, with wild hair and a poorly cut dress. And beneath her terror and fear and resignation, there was a spark of relief, because at least Draco wasn't there to witness her inevitable death. But then Bellatrix grinned as her eyes flickered from Hermione to Ron, and finally to Harry. "Get Draco," she breathed, her voice scratchy and Hermione's heart squeezed painfully. And yet she felt a fleeting happiness as she saw him, and the strange urge to try and tame her hair to look somewhat presentable, although he didn't look much better than her. Yes, he was sharply dressed and handsome as ever, but he didn't look healthy. He was too thin, and the dark circles underneath his eyes too deep, and his skin sickly pale. The last remains of color promptly drained from his face when his eyes met hers, and he looked as if he were about to faint. But he didn't. Instead, he swallowed convulsively as he continued to hold her gaze. His steps faltered before he jerked his head away and focused on his parents and aunt again. "You called for me, Aunt Bella." The tremor in his voice was almost unnoticeable, but there was a tension in his shoulders that looked almost painful. "We have some unexpected guests, Draco. Maybe you can tell us who they are." Bellatrix piped as she forced Harry to his knees, who groaned in pain. Her claw-like hands tugged his head back sharply, and her wand dug into his neck. "Well?" Hermione saw how Draco's hands clenched into fists before they relaxed again. "I can't be sure." His thin voice trailed off. "Draco." And then Lucius Malfoy stepped up to his son and put a comforting hand on Draco's shoulder. "Look closely, son." The Malfoy patriarch glanced at Hermione and Ron. "If we are the ones to hand Potter over to the Dark Lord, everything will be forgiven. It will all be as it was. Do you understand?" And Draco nodded. It was an abrupt jerk of his head, but it still made his father smile proudly. And then one of the snatchers piped up, and all gentleness left Lucius Malfoy's face as he shouted at the other man until Narcissa intervened. The delicate nymph of a woman put a soothing hand on her husband's arm, who seemed to melt under her touch. Without any resistance, he followed her a little to the side where she whispered quiet assurances. Silence settled over the room, but only for a second, because Bellatrix raised to her feet again. "Don't be shy, sweetie. Come over," she crooned, taking Draco's hand in hers to tug him towards Harry. She guided him to his knees, her hand resting on his shoulder, but unlike his father's, her touch didn't seem to have been a gesture of comfort. Instead, it radiated control and barely contained rage. "Now, if this isn't who we think it is, Draco, and we call him, he will kill us all. We need to be absolutely sure." That ignited a spark of hope in Hermione's heart, because at least they would have time. If Draco didn't identify Harry, Then they would have to wait until the hex wore off to properly identify him. And that would mean hours during which she could try to come up with a plan to save them. "What happened to his face?" Draco whispered, and Bellatrix's head snapped up. "Yes, what happened to his face?" she demanded from the leader of the Snatchers, who merely shrugged his shoulders. "Maybe it was a stinging jinx." Her dark eyes skipped to Hermione, and then the clawish wand pointed in her direction. "Was it you, dear?" The heels of her shoes clacked as she approached her and Ron, and Hermione saw how Draco glanced towards them over his shoulder, panic written across his face. She shook her head ever so slightly, and he opened his mouth as if in protest. But then he turned around to face Harry again. "Give me her wand. I want to see what her last spell was," Bellatrix ordered, while Narcissa approached her son, having noticed his hesitance. Hermione watched how she ran a hand over his crown of bright hair, whispering something too quiet for her to hear. She strained her ears to no avail, only to flinch when Bellatrix suddenly started shouting, and then a fight broke out between Bellatrix and the Snatchers, who were no match for the half-crazed witch. Spells flew, and Fenrir Greyback let go of them to free himself of a snake that was suddenly wrapped around his throat. Ron was immediately in front of her, trying to shield her from any stray spells, but Hermione only had eyes for one person. Over Ron's shoulder she saw Draco, who had been dragged to his feet by his father. Lucius Malfoy had tugged his son and wife behind him in an attempt to protect them from the battle taking place in the center of the drawing room. A battle that was quickly over, as Hermione had to admit that Bellatrix Lestrange was powerful and dangerous, and slightly insane. And that mixture made dread settle in her stomach as Bellatrix ordered Harry and Ron to be taken to the cellar, tittering something about "the girls having a little chat." Harry had once tried to describe the Cruciatus Curse to her. He had told her the incantation and the wand movement, and Hermione knew that theoretically. She knew how to cast it. He had also told her how it had felt. Pure agony, pain beyond what could be imagined, as every cell of one's body screamed for death because it was simply too much. There was nothing like it. No spell as devious or sickening. It was, in his opinion, the worst of all the unforgivables. Hermione had nodded and made careful notes in her study journal, and she had fooled herself when she thought that she understood it, because his description hadn't prepared her for the first time Bellatrix spoke the incantation. Nothing had. Not even Dolohov's heart-burning curse that had been the most painful experience of her life. Until now. A scream ripped from Hermione's throat as she twisted on the cold ground, clawing at anything within reach in an attempt to escape the agony that defined her very existence. She wanted to die. She yearned for death. The plea for Bellatrix to use the death curse on her, or for her to call Dolohov so he could finally kill her with another heart-burning curse, was on the tip of her tongue. Bellatrix twitched her wand away, and suddenly Hermione could breathe again. Her body was shaking, her muscles trembling, but the pain was gone as quickly as it had come. She sobbed, her chest heaving as her mind tried to comprehend what had happened. One moment she had been standing, and the next she had heard Crucio, and her existence had been defined by agony. "Are you willing to talk now, little mudblood?" Bellatrix sing-songed above her, only to sigh pitifully when Hermione didn't give an answer. "No matter. You will talk sooner or later," she promised and raised her wand again. Hermione's body seized as the pain erupted in her. She couldn't think. Her mind was scrambled, her thoughts racing like a beehive, overwhelmed by the physical agony. The fate of Neville's parents was suddenly at the forefront of her mind. She almost laughed. She would lose the one thing she valued most about herself. Her mind. It would shatter, be broken beyond repair, and should she somehow survive this dreadful war, her future would undoubtedly be in the Janus Thicky ward. The pain was too much for her to handle, and even if she had wanted to, she wouldn't have been able to tell Bellatrix anything, because at this point she could barely remember what words were, never mind how to use them. She twisted in another feeble attempt to escape the feeling of being burned alive, only for the world to suddenly stop. Her mind slowed down. Everything did, and she lost herself in an endless sea of pale blue. It tethered her mind, giving her something to hold on to, giving herself something she could focus on as to not lose herself. Her eyes roamed over to him, his pale face and his stiff stance, his fingers that were clenched around a wand he was slowly raising. No! She screeched. No, 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 don't! She had remembered how to use words again. Please don't! Please! Draco paused. Please! Please! The last word was merely a sob. He couldn't. He couldn't! If he raised his wand, if he defended her, he would die as well. And Hermione couldn't let him die. She couldn't bear the thought of seeing him die after having witnessed it countless times in her nightmares. He needed to survive. Please, Hermione whimpered, and then slowly Draco loosened the grip he had on his wand, and although she could still see the anguish in his eyes, there was a newfound resolve in him. He would listen to her. He would be safe, at least from this. Oh, is the little mudblood begging? The pain was gone as fingers wrapped around her jaw. They tilted her face until she was forced to look away from Draco and at Bellatrix instead. So weak, so easy to break. Another sign of her inferior breeding. Something in her hand reflected the moonlight, and Hermione's heart stuttered. A knife. But as much fun as our little game is, we really do need to know if that little friend of yours is Potter or not. So I think I'll resort to something more appropriate for your heritage. Laced with a bit of magic, of course. Normal knives are just so boring. Bellatrix smiled sweetly as she lowered the blade to Hermione's face. The cold metal ran across her cheek, an almost gentle caress that tickled and left her skin unmarred. She didn't dare breathe, afraid that even the slightest movement would make it cut her. Now, where to start? So much pale skin to slice. Bellatrix clicked her tongue. Maybe I'll start with your pretty face. But then again, I know someone who thinks you're quite lovely and has been trying to get his hands on you for a while. Wouldn't want to ruin it for him. Tell me, Mudblood, are you a virgin? The dark wand in the Mad Witch's right hand flared up as she cast a silent spell, and then an insane cackle of delight escaped her. Oh, you are! How precious! Dolohov will owe me for this lovely gift. Yes, I think I will cut somewhere else. How about here? Long nails tapped against her left sleeve. A mark, branding you for what you are, just like our Dark Lord branded those who were worthy of wearing their loyalty to him. A sign declaring how inferior you are. Yes, it will certainly amuse him. Long nails were tugging on Hermione's sleeve, ripping it as it was pushed above her elbow. But then Bellatrix's hands faltered. Where did you get this? Her voice was shrill as she tightened her grip on Hermione's arm. When she tilted her head, she saw that Bellatrix Lestrange's eyes were fixed on the bracelet that had been hidden just moments ago. Tell me, you filthy mudblood! Where did you get a black family heirloom, you dirty thief? She screeched, fury blazing in her dark eyes. Tell me now, or I will cut the truth out of you. Bella, a voice interrupted, belonging to no other than Narcissa Malfoy. The family heirlooms have been locked away for decades. This can't be. Do you take me for a fool, sister? This is Mother's betrothal bracelet. I would recognize it anywhere. And last I heard, you were the one to inherit it. How did the mudblood get the chance to sully it with her disgusting hands? Have your security wards been so lax that someone like her can just stroll into the manor? Bellatrix was seething now, the crazy sheen in her gaze fueled by insanity. It can't be, Mrs. Malfoy disagreed, her soft voice surprisingly sharp. There was a small gasp when Bellatrix twisted Hermione's arm painfully to show off the bracelet. And then Narcissa Malfoy was in Hermione's line of sight. A small frown marred the older witch's face as she inspected the bracelet. Her blue eyes lingered on the band of diamonds for a moment, before they flickered to Hermione. They scrutinized her closely, but there was no arrogance or hatred in them, only confusion. Thoughtfully, she turned her head ever so slightly so that she could look at her son. But Draco didn't look at his mother. He was still only staring at Hermione, and she desperately wished he would look away. It wasn't safe for him. He had to pretend that he felt nothing for her, except hatred. If anyone found out that he had given her the bracelet, that he had warned and protected her, his side didn't tolerate missteps like that. And the punishment was undoubtedly a brief and swift killing curse, but not without a few casts of the Cruciatus beforehand. Suddenly, Narcissa Malfoy's mouth dropped open in a small, astonished, "Oh." Her blue eyes returned to Hermione, flickering between her face and her bracelet. Hermione's heart was racing, drumming inside her chest with fear. Draco's family were loyal to Voldemort, and had been since long before the First Wizarding War. Undoubtedly she would— Mrs. Malfoy suddenly turned on her heels and went to her husband, putting her hand on his arm. She whispered something to him, and even though Hermione couldn't understand her, her voice sounded urgent. Mr. Malfoy frowned in return and shook his head, but she seemed to insist on whatever she was saying. What he would have done, Hermione would never find out, because at that moment Ron, and a very much no longer jinxed Harry, appeared in one of the doors leading to the drawing-room. Spells flew, and it briefly seemed as if they had the upper hand, had it not been for Bellatrix Lestrange. One moment, Hermione was lying on the hard wooden floor, and the next she was tugged to her feet by her hair, and then pressed against an equally slender but slightly taller body. And there was something cold and sharp pressed against her neck. In an instant, the battle ended, and to her horror, Harry and Ron surrendered. Their fate was sealed. "Call him!" Bella ordered her brother-in-law sharply, and Hermione's heart seized. She tilted her head ever so slightly until she felt the bite of the cursed knife against her skin. It was enough to be able to look at Lucius Malfoy. Lucius Malfoy, who was looking first at his pale and disarmed wife, then at Draco, and finally at her. His blue eyes were so much like his son's, and Hermione felt a tear trail down her cheek. "I said, call him!" The woman behind her barked again, and Mr. Malfoy pulled up his sleeve, revealing the dark mark. He held out his hand, hovering it above the brand, and Hermione knew they were lost. And they might have been, had it not been for Narcissa Malfoy. Her pale hand was resting on her husband's shoulder, stopping him with quiet, calm insistence. "Lucius," she said, voice soft but pressing, and the Malfoy patriarch paused. There was a struggle in his eyes, but his wife cupped his cheek and tilted his head away from Hermione, until he was forced to look at the woman at his side. And suddenly his face was marred with something akin to defeat, a defeat that had seemed to cut to the very essence of his being and changed something fundamental within him. "Sissa! What are you doing?" Bellatrix sounded shrill, and Mrs. Malfoy straightened, stepping back from her silent husband. She turned around and regarded her sister almost haughtily. "No. What are you doing, Bella?" Her voice was icy. "First you insist that this insignificant witch stole our mother's betrothal bracelet, and then you demand we disturb the Dark Lord without ensuring that this truly is Harry Potter. I will not risk the lives of my husband and child by falling for another trick." Narcissa Malfoy would have made a wonderful general, or a lawyer, because for a moment it truly seemed like her sister would relent and listen to her. Hermione felt how Bellatrix faltered. The knife at her throat began to tremble. And then there was a pop, and suddenly chaos broke out again. Through the haze of exhaustion, adrenaline, and fear, Hermione barely noticed the creaking noise. It wasn't until Bellatrix pushed her away and the resounding crash of a chandelier hitting the ground that Hermione noticed Dobby. She stumbled, her muscles still trembling from the aftermath of the Cruciatus, and then crashed into something, or rather, someone. Hands were steadying her, their grip firm but careful, as if she would shatter if touched too harshly. Hermione only belatedly realized that she was being steadied by Draco. No, not steadied. She had fallen onto him, and he had hit a sturdy, dark chair, inevitably propping both of them up. Her nose was pressed up against his shoulder, and his hands felt scorching hot as they were resting on her waist and the small of her back. Slightly dazed, she pulled back until she could look at his face. They were so close that his mouth almost brushed against hers, and for a split second she wished he would kiss her, uncaring of the consequences. Hermione. She wasn't sure if she had imagined her name falling from his lips in a pained whisper. And then he was gone as someone tugged her away. "Don't touch her, you bastard!" Ron shouted at Malfoy as he dragged her with him towards Harry and Dobby. Hermione almost fought against his tight grip because they couldn't leave, not without Draco, not without making sure he was safe. Before she could, the tug of apparition made the drawing-room disappear. Instead of staring at Slytherin green drapes and dark wallpaper, there was only water. An ocean stretching towards the horizon framed by white cliffs. The scent of salt and sea mud filled her senses, and Hermione briefly noticed that there was something solid in her hand that responded curiously to her magical core before she fainted. Malfoy had given her his wand, or had she accidentally taken it from him? Hermione didn't know, and she wasn't in the right state of mind to contemplate it either. The effects of the Cruciatus curse lingered longer than they should have. According to Bill, it was due to her still not quite healed heart and the after effects of the incident at the DOM. It left her weak and unable to stay conscious for more than a few hours. Had it not been for the bracelet, which had lessened the effects, she would have needed months to recover, if she had been able to recover from it at all. Bill had been utterly fascinated by the delicate piece of jewelry and accepted Hermione's unwillingness to explain where she got it, or from whom, with a nod of his head. Still, he had inspected it carefully and been suitably impressed by the intricate spellwork. And he had promptly become one of her favorite Weasleys when he hadn't made a comment about pure-blood customs and betrothal jewelry, although there had been a knowing expression in his kind eyes. And neither did he comment on the large potion supply in her beaded bag, although he had most likely recognized the spindly handwriting on the labels. He had once attended Professor Snape's classes as well, and had him mark his essays from his first year until he had taken his newts. But Hermione felt no relief. Not about their escape, not about Bill's secrecy, not even about her own health. Not when there was a small grave in the tall dunes. Not when Dobby had died to save their lives. And not when she didn't know what had happened to Draco. Some nights she cried herself to sleep, suffocating on the guilt of being so worried about Draco that she felt too detached to properly mourn Dobby. But they moved on, as they always had. There was simply so much at stake, so much more, and finally they had an advantage, because somehow Hermione had gotten her hands on one of Bellatrix's hairs. Hermione wondered if she would ever grow used to the taste of Polyjuice potion, but sincerely hoped she wouldn't have to drink the blasted potion often enough to grow accustomed to it. She also wondered if she would ever grow used to soaring through the sky, because after riding a blasted dragon, surely brooms weren't that bad anymore. At least one didn't have to jump off their backs and into a lake. Merlin, she thought, drenched to the bone and still dressed up as Bellatrix. Why can't I ever have a normal year? Just 1 year where I'm not confronted by basilisks or werewolves or forced to ride a thestral or a dragon. Is that too much to ask for? But it had been worth it. They had successfully snuck into Gringotts, had broken into Bellatrix's vault, and collected another Horcrux, although Hermione felt a pang of regret about planning on destroying such a significant item. First, the Slytherin locket, and now they planned on how to destroy the cup and Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem. And yet, she was filled with resolve as she apparated straight to Hogsmeade, because they were one step closer to destroying Voldemort and ending the war. They were met by a man vaguely resembling Dumbledore. When he introduced himself as his brother Aberforth, Dumbledore's brother and a member of the Order, they didn't hesitate to follow him. After Godric's Hollow and the incident at the Lovegood home, Hermione was suspicious and tense, looking for any indication that they were walking into another trap. Her suspicions disappeared the moment Neville stepped out of the portrait, and then there was just relief. She hugged him twice and kissed his cheek, making him blush to the tips of his ears and duck his head as he swiftly led them back through the tunnel towards the castle. The series of hugs continued once they had arrived at Hogwarts and were reunited with the remaining members of the DA. Hermione was positively giddy, biting her lip to stifle a girlish giggle when Ginny and Harry were reunited. It was enough that she could deal with the piercing stab of pain as she once thought again about Draco. Draco, whom she dreamed about every night. Sometimes they were echoes of luring dreams the locket had conjured, but mostly they were nightmares. Sometimes she was the one to find his body. Other times she only found out about his death through an offhand remark made by someone else. Those were the most painful dreams, because he was too important to just be a footnote in a story. When Harry asked the DA about Draco, Snape, and the Carrows, Ginny said that Draco hadn't returned after he had gone home for the Easter holidays, and that there were rumors that Voldemort had taken his anger over their escape out on the Malfoys. Hermione kept her calm and stoic demeanor until she was alone in the bathroom. Then she vomited until she was left shaking and trembling. She was enough of a realist to know that in the unlikely case that Draco was still alive, the torture he must have been subjected to undoubtedly made her little encounter with Bellatrix seem like a pleasant afternoon tea ceremony. If he was alive, and the odds weren't in his favor. Not with a megalomaniac such as Voldemort. It was almost amusing how calm the realization that Draco might have died had made her. As she walked down the dark and dreary corridors in a sea of subdued and trembling students, Hermione felt strangely peaceful, detached almost. Whereas her time at Hogwarts under Umbridge's rule had been almost unbearable, she could now ignore the presence of the Carrows. If Harry and Ron had noticed her strange behavior, they hadn't pointed it out. Most likely, they thought she was simply determined to get through this without any of them losing their limbs or lives. Hermione briefly wondered what she might have felt entering the Great Hall again, had she not been so numb. But as it was, she merely took her place amongst the student body, subtly keeping her eyes on Ron and Harry. It was only the appearance of Professor Snape that shook her out of her stupor. Standing tall and gaunt and sickly pale, where once Dumbledore had welcomed them to Hogwarts with a smile and a promise of wonderful years to come. His face was a carefully maintained mask. Framed by the Carrows, he looked every bit the loyal and faithful servant to Voldemort. His face was impassive, and there wasn't even a flicker of surprise when Harry stepped forward to confront him. Ron followed, and then Hermione left her place in the long row of students as well. Her professor's black eyes seemed to zero in on her. As she held his gaze, she could see his expression stutter. For a moment, he looked almost pained. But then the mask had slipped back into place, and he showed no other reaction. Not when Harry was speaking. Not when McGonagall got involved, and not when he had to raise his wand as the older witch fired spell after spell at him. He never returned any of them, merely throwing up one shield after another before finally he fled. The puzzle that was Severus Snape remained as unsolvable as it had always been.